In the name of the Holy Trinity, one God, Amen. Today's gospel has some hair-raising sayings, but it's also a puzzle. It seems to lurch from one disconnected part to another. First, John reports that he has tried to stop an exorcist from casting out demons in Jesus' name because the exorcist wasn't part of their circle, their inner circle. Jesus corrects him, saying, "Whoever is not against us is for us." Then, in an apparent non sequitur, Jesus speaks about little children. Who are they and where are they? Finally, at length, Jesus chides John with apocalyptic visions of punishment. What's going on? We've been reading through Mark this summer and been reminded that this gospel is incredibly dense and spare. Things happen one after another without a breath. Go from one episode, one teaching, one miracle to another. So today's gospel is just a small slice, an excerpt in the middle of a thick cluster of moral teachings. And if we look back a few verses, we can better understand what's going on. Just 5 verses before this, Jesus had predicted his death for the second time. And the gospel tells us the disciples did not understand what he was saying and were afraid to ask him. Instead, as they walked along, they argued among themselves about who was the greatest. Jesus overheard this, sat them down, and tried to set them straight, saying, "Whoever wants to be first, that is the greatest, must be last of all and servant of all." Then Jesus took a little child in his arms and said to the disciples, "Whoever welcomes one such child in my name welcomes me. And whoever welcomes me welcomes not me, but the one who sent me." Now we see, because our text immediately follows, now we see that John had interrupted Jesus' teaching with his complaint about the exorcist. The little ones in that text before, in our text, are symbolized by the child that Jesus is still holding in his arms, and he resumes that lesson. Now we know that children had no status in that society. So by honoring a child, Jesus was demonstrating the radical call to share God's love and respect and care with all humankind, regardless of who they were, regardless of their status, their age, their creed. He was embodying the humility that it takes to be last and servant of all. Then Jesus went on to vent his frustration at length. And we certainly are shocked by the intensity of his words. But remember, and we've heard these throughout the summer, Mark is much more given to apocalyptic vision than any other gospel, to that language, that strong, scalding language. And Jesus he meant this for them all, not just for John. This strong language was meant to shake them up, make them pay attention, make them take in a vital lesson, a key lesson, to always to respect and protect the innocent and the vulnerable, to be self-aware and self-disciplining. Key, also, to be very, very wary of delusions of power over anyone. Now, I recall one such wake-up moment in seminary. Professor Will Spong, who was usually so softly, gently spoken, Once he raised his voice very angrily, and he got our attention, which was the point. He said, "Don't you ever take away someone's denial." The point and the deep, deep truth there is that denial may shelter the wounded soul. Often it does. Shelter the soul for the time it needs to accept the reality of loss and grief. So rather than try to fix something or someone, which is such a temptation, a pastoral minister who's lay or ordained must tenderly listen, hold the space, and trust God's own healing will happen in God's own time. Another ministry lesson I got was that not all innocents are children. This happened to me when I was associate rector at St. Matthew's in Austin. I was really surprised. I was taken aback when an elderly parishioner assured me that God had created the world in 7 days. That's the way it was written in Genesis, and that was the truth. I took a deep breath, because who was I to contradict the deep faith, the bedrock faith of this child of God? And interestingly, after that, I began to muse on, if there are 7 days in creation, what does one day in God's life look like? And how long is it? How many billions of years is a day in God's life? Back to the gospel. We can sympathize with Jesus. He is he's in fact, the next verse after our gospel is, he set his face for Jerusalem. He's going to his destiny, and he is desperate to impart to his disciples the lessons they need. He's told them twice explicitly that he's going to die. They refuse to hear it. And they don't understand what he's trying to tell them, so they'll be able to do the work after his death, continue the work after his death. At the same time, we can cut the disciples some slack. I don't know about you, but I identify all too frequently with the foibles of the disciples. After all, they're just simple people who work with their hands. And they've been pulled into this unfathomable reality. A great cosmic force has swept them in. And they find themselves in a series of events that are going to change human history. It's not surprising that they're overwhelmed and confused. Think of all the miracles, one after another. And they react as anybody might. They push back or they shut down. Of course, they deny the horror that Jesus is going to be killed. And even more, the real nonsense idea that he would rise again. So it's not surprising that they might try to slow down or tame this whirlwind in which they find themselves. And I think that's part of what John did with his interruption. All of the disciples probably feel more or less the same way that I just described, but only Peter and John have the gall to contradict Jesus. Peter did, you remember, after the first prediction that Jesus was going to die and got shut down by Jesus, rebuked by Jesus. Peter and John and James are the closest disciples. They have already witnessed the transfiguration. And Jesus is clearly training them for leadership. But leadership is something you grow into. And John has overstepped his understanding of his role in this trying to stop the exorcist. Now, there's an interesting parallel in the lesson from Numbers. Poor old Moses has been trudging through the desert for many, many years and is stuck between a complaining group of people, endlessly complaining, and God who's angry at the people. And here's Moses in the middle. So he pleads to God, take my life. I can't do this anymore. And God responds by sending his Spirit, God's Spirit, sharing God's Spirit with a trusted group of 70 people who've been designated as leaders and who will help Moses manage the vast crowd. Joshua was a trusted disciple of Moses, a trusted assistant, very analogous to John with Jesus. And when Joshua learned that the Spirit had also descended upon Eldad and Medad, who were outside the gathering, he reacted protectively in the same way that John did with the exorcist. Joshua appealed to Moses to stop them. And Moses' wonderful response was, "Are you jealous for my sake? Would that all the Lord's people were prophets and that the Lord would put his Spirit on them." Like Jesus with the exorcist, Moses trusted and honored God's independent action. It reminds me of another Will Spong story. Will Spong used to say, rather regularly, because we needed to hear it, "God is God and we are not." In Jesus' life and ministry, he often carries the message of God's love far beyond his own country and his own creed. Sometimes, as with the Samaritan woman at the well, he finds it's already there. And Pope Francis recently reflected the same openness to God's action when he said, "All religions are paths to God." Now, I'm someone who reads the news compulsively, and I don't know about you, but I get burdened by the negativity of the news. And there's been several people have decided to stake out a claim in positive news, in various positive emails. The one I get that I recommend is called Fix the News. And it's two extraordinary people in Australia who comb the global news and find good news to share. I read it this morning, which is why I'm thinking of this, because the point is that, yes, God works through all faiths, but God isn't bound by any faith. God works throughout the world with individuals, with organizations, and even with governments to deliver God's mercy. And just this last week at the UN, world leaders adopted a pact for the future by consensus. This is part of the good news of the day about God's abundant mercy and care for the vulnerable and the innocent. They signed, "We believe there is a path to a brighter future for all of humanity, including those living in poverty and vulnerable situations. Through the actions we take today," this is adopted by consensus at the UN, "through the actions we take today, we resolve to set ourselves on that path, striving for a world that is safe, peaceful, just, equal, inclusive, sustainable, and prosperous. A world in which well-being, security, and dignity, and a healthy planet are assured for all humanity." In our Eucharistic prayer, we say, "Open our eyes to see God's hand at work in the world around us. That's what I see in this." And it's clear to me that Jesus and Moses and Pope Francis all recognize that God is alive in the world, way beyond anything that we achieve or that we can even understand. If Moses and Jesus and St. Francis can trust God with that, so can we. Amen.